Hey everybody, I'm Trace. Thanks for tuning in to Seeker. We're here at the Democratic National Convention, and we're talking to people all week doing these live streams, so make sure that you subscribe. This is day 2 of our convention coverage, and I have here with me John Idarola from the Young Turks and Jackie Coppell, like Bell, which I just learned.
Yes.
And today we're talking about kind of what's going on day 2, right? We're going to talk about voter demographics today, but yesterday, just briefly, there were some amazing speeches. There were candidates with a lot of different backgrounds, I noticed. Like last night, there were candidates from diverse races, sexualities, ethnicities, like all speaking on the same stage in a row, which is incredible, right?
Yeah. So you had a variety of sexual orientations. You had people who were abled, people who were disabled. I mean, you had the representation of what America actually looks like, both on the stage and also amongst the delegates. I walked around both halls, and they looked very different, DNC to RNC.
Boy, did they ever. I think I saw more diversity in the first 5 minutes of getting to the DNC than I saw in the entirety of the RNC. So to say that there is more diversity is sort of the understatement of the century.
Kind of, yeah.
Given the demographics of the parties, particularly right now as they are.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't at the RNC. We had my co-host Jules over there, so he probably would have more to say on that. But it seems like that's the sentiment that I'm getting as well, that the DNC is much more diverse, even with the Paul Ryan photo of like the White House intern corps. For them. I mean, it's pretty interesting. So we're going to talk about, basically, there's this Pew study that has come out, and it's talking about voter demographics and showing how they've changed. So I've got some notes here, and essentially it says that this is the most ethnically and racially diverse voter pool in U.S. history, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got 1 in 3 eligible voters being Hispanic, Black, Asian, or another racial or ethnic minority, and that's pretty huge. That's up almost a third from 2012.
Yeah, and it's a trend that not only has existed up until today, but there's no signs that it's going to change. And I was doing some additional research, and I was surprised to find out that even amongst white voters, even amongst white male voters, there's a significant change every 4 years in the whites with college degrees versus whites without college degrees. That second group obviously votes at much higher rates for Republican candidates, and it every 4 years goes down about 3 percentage points, whereas whites with degrees, either college or above, goes up 1 percentage point every 4 years. So you're seeing a pretty big shift, even amongst white voters, away from what the Republicans would probably ideally like to see.
Yeah.
I think you're going to continue to see a diverging, and we see this especially age-wise. I think college for sure, but also age. There's a difference in terms of how white voters vote as they get older versus when they are younger. And given the term everyone loves, the millennials, and how they vote and how they will vote, et cetera, that will continue to evolve over time. But we're certainly seeing a huge shift, which I think is really exciting.
Yeah.
It means that there's, people, hopefully, my hope is that people are maybe getting, as they get older, or going through the process of becoming an adult, they're getting more information. They're becoming more educated about the things that they want.
Yeah.
That is encouraging to me.
Yeah, agreed.
And at the same time, though, I think that either Democrats around the country or the Democratic leadership, they can't simply look at these trends and then assume, then we got this in the bag in 2 or 3 elections, because we're going to get into a lot of different angles of it in terms of voter registration, how often they actually go out and vote, but then also certain groups that are rising at huge rates, even in the past 4 or 8 years, like Hispanic voters, Asian voters. Those numbers are going up, but for the most part, they're going up in states that are already non-competitive, like California and Texas, where you're providing a nice big buffer in the popular vote as those numbers change, but you're not really changing the Electoral College math all that much.
Well, Texas you would be.
Theoretically,
In
once
theory,
you flip it, but you can build up quite a bit over the course of a couple of decades without really changing the vote necessarily.
Yeah, especially with issues with gerrymandering and other problems with that whole system that we don't necessarily have to get into. It was interesting because I was looking up some demographic numbers to take notes for this live stream, and 1988, according to Pew's numbers, they didn't really have like the Asian vote demographic, and even now it's only at about 4%. Even in the 2016 numbers. So like that vote is grown significantly, potentially. I mean, it was at 1 or 2%. And they don't even take into account, which I definitely wanted to mention, that Hispanics can be of any race under most of these polling numbers. And that Arab Americans are usually counted as white in these polling numbers as well, which I thought was really interesting. Kudos to our AP Lauren for looking into how they're doing their methodology. And it also talked about how American Indians, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, and multi-race Americans aren't even really included in their graphics most of the time when they publish those numbers. So there's a lot more, I think, to the picture than we're even seeing in that way.
In terms of nuance and as the numbers grow, interestingly, what's happening in Florida, as I understand it, a friend worked on Voto Latino, still does, but certainly did a lot of work in 2012. And she was mentioning how in Florida, obviously, there's a very large Hispanic population, but oftentimes it's Cuban. And that Cuban population actually tends to be more conservative. However, over the past few years, even decade, apparently a lot of Puerto Ricans have actually moved into Florida. So there's a sense that Florida is shifting for a lot of reasons, and whereas the Cuban vote may have skewed more conservative, traditionally Republican, the influx of the Puerto Rican vote may actually counterbalance it in a very large way.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you're talking about like within one state the changes that can happen, because like you mentioned that the Asian vote is still a very small percentage, which means that unfortunately in terms of presidential politics, it's probably not going to get they're not going to get their due. But in congressional races, in state level races, they can be much more important, and they can actually gain the attention of politicians and start to become important, perhaps nationally going forward. It's going to take a while, though.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like we mostly discuss kind of national level politics, especially when we're talking in groups for 30 minutes or so, right?
Yeah.
But those state level races are really where change can be affected, like on a number of different levels.
Yeah.
So it's important to remember that even though the demographic number might seem small, it still can make a big splash if those have densities in certain parts of the country.
Not to mention, you never know where money can come from.
Yeah.
So even if, small and mighty can have, some real power behind it if there is, no matter who it is, if there is money. Whether, that's a money in politics conversation, separate conversation.
Kind of a whole other
but
thing.
I did want to, mention that you can have your voice heard, whether it's because you are voting as a block or because you are donating as a block, whatever that may be.
Yeah, very true. And I like the conversation about how we're getting kind of less white as a voter demographic, which we've sort of kind of touched on, which I found really interesting because in 1988, the voter demographics were 82% in change white. In 2012, it was 69% white. Yeah. But that's not a huge, it's a big change. 81 to 69 is big, but it's 12%, 13%.
Yeah, which, look, if all else was equal, might not matter that much. But if one party is banking their presidential chances on that demographic alone, you can't necessarily afford to lose 13 or 15% of it unless you start to make inroads into other communities. On the other hand, if you say that you're going to do that, and then for 4 or 8 years you completely forget to do so, and then nominate a man who's absolutely horrendous amongst those groups, then you might find that shift is enough to make it very hard for you to win.
Keeping in mind that, Obama won, he won and it was decided, but in terms of the popular vote, there wasn't huge numbers, right? I think it was 3%. So if you're talking about a shift, that's actually can be a massive shift. And to your very point, if you're not actually going to do outreach to the people who you recognize can give you those votes, then the other party, in this case we're talking about the Democratic Party, can probably rely on those votes for a fair amount of time. There was concern after that report came out that, oh no, the Republicans were going to do outreach and, the grand plans of the Democratic takeover were going to be, lost. Well, here we are today.
Yeah. Do you think that the fact that the demographics are less white is going to benefit? The ideal right now, I guess, is that it's probably going to benefit more the Democrats. But do you think as demographics shift, there are groups that as they grow or shrink, it's going to hit third parties in a different way? Or is there any sense of kind of how those demographics are going to shift, or any ideas?
I don't really know exactly how they would affect third parties, although I'm sure it would have an effect. I do think that for the Republican Party, this might be the Custer's last stand of all we need is whites, mostly males, and that will be enough. They're literally getting older. There's fewer of them in each election. And while it's easy to write articles, and when I was in poli-sci, there were a lot of articles written about the death of the Republican Party once these demographics change enough. Parties can be very stubborn, but they're not going to simply opt out of winning presidential elections for decades. And when you start to lose in an important group, you will be forced, whether you want to or not, to change your policies, to change who you're electing to represent you. We've already seen that. I mean, Marco Rubio did very well, partially because of his demographic characteristics. And so they might lose a couple of presidential elections, a couple of House cycles or something like that. But then they're going to have to be forced to adapt.
The demographics that's just what'll happen.
Yeah.
Just as John was saying, you only want to lose for so long, and then you're like, we probably really need to change things up.
Right.
And I do. It really feels like, you hate to say it, but this is like last stand for the white man.
Right,
really going for it, and the rhetoric is certainly backing that up. That this is white, mostly men versus everyone else, and it's almost like a dare. We dare you to beat us. We dare you. We're going to come out in full force. And a lot of it, we were talking before, a lot of it does come from the, non-college educated white demographic. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that when you go to college, you don't get everything from college. I don't want to, but when you go to college,
put too much on a pedestal there.
Right.
Yeah.
But you encounter people who are different because people oftentimes are coming either from out of state or even just other counties, but you're meeting other people and you're surrounded by other ideas, and hopefully in education you're getting some insight into,
right.
I loved college and I got a ton of insight, but to each their own, but you're at least getting a little bit more information than the world in which you grew up. Yeah. And I think that lends itself enormously to the shifts that we're seeing within these groups.
Yeah.
If I can say one other thing, so we're talking about the rise of all of these other groups, and then you have the still extremely large but growing smaller white vote. And we know that for Trump, like whites, especially white males, that's what he's banking on. And when you see that they're supporting Trump, it's easy to say, well, maybe it's for the best that they're not going to determine the president in all likelihood. But they're still Americans, and they're still people, and their concerns deserve to be addressed. And the biggest tragedy, I think, in how much they're going for Trump is that they're being sold a bill of goods by him. They're being convinced that politically correct language is the thing that's holding them back in this country. And the economic plans of Donald Trump would be absolutely horrendous for most of his, especially poor, non-college educated white voters. And that's the biggest problem. Not just that they're supporting Trump, but that they're supporting him for the wrong reasons. And that's why the Democrats can't simply afford, nor should they morally, ethically, not try to appeal to those people, to try to get them to realize that, as has been common throughout American history, they're being told that it's the others. You have to go against them. It's you or them. No, it's all of us. And if the Democrats can shift their economic message a little bit and try to appeal to that group in a way that they might not be right now, I think that would be both the moral thing to do and also electorally it would be a great idea for Democrats.
There was an incredible article I read just the other day, and I don't quote me on it, but do try and Google it, because it was sort of breathtaking in its ability to really break down. It wasn't an article; it was an interview with an author of a book. Again, don't quote me. I think
paraphrasing.
Paraphrasing. Yes, everyone. I'm paraphrasing. If you Google it, it'll come up. It starts with the first word I do remember is hillbilly. It's like hillbilly elegy. I can't. Again, but the point of it was the author grew up in a very white rural town and ended up going into the Marines and ended up actually going to Yale. And so he was able to live in sort of both of these worlds, this very conservative world, this hyper-liberal world. And he does a beautiful job of actually saying everyone is at fault, but do not disregard these people because their fears and their concerns are real, and they can't and shouldn't be forgotten. And we shouldn't, the elites shouldn't thumb their nose, and likewise, conservatives shouldn't necessarily bank on the fact that they'll always be there, because whoever is actually going to address their needs is probably going to ultimately win their votes. Right now, Donald Trump talks like them.
Yes.
And they look at him and say, well, he's speaking like me, and he's speaking about the things that I'm concerned about.
Right.
And his point was, that's all they want to hear.
Yeah, and I mean that's his power right now, is that he's able to get to these voters where they live, right? He's able to speak to them in a way that doesn't make voters feel stupid. It doesn't make voters feel like they're alienated. There's somebody who's got them, and he's there where they live, and that's his appeal to a lot of voters, I imagine. And as the demographics shift, that has changed in some ways. the vote isn't just getting less white, it's also getting younger. This is the first time millennials are a bigger group in the voting bloc than baby boomers.
Yeah.
Something like, I think, 60-some million, almost 70 million baby boomers, and we're at just about to pass them. It's 69.2, they're 69.7 million.
Yeah.
So next time around, the millennials are likely going to be larger than the baby boomers, and then Gen X surpasses baby boomers by 2028, according to my notes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as we get younger, that also changes how voters are going to look at their leaders.
Yeah.
Right?
We're already seeing it from an issue-based perspective, right? I mean, you want to give credit where credit's due. All of a sudden, we are talking about LGBT rights, and you're talking about issues that these social issues were previously thought to be, that which we hang our hats.
Yeah.
But that's changing, and young people look at race really differently. They look at sexual orientation really differently, and
America's place in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that will have huge implications on our future.
Yeah.
Yeah, and look, we're right to focus on the demographic characteristics that we are, but in the background, there's things like the percentage of the vote that identifies as secular of whatever flavor, that increases every couple of years.
Sure.
And so there's a lot of things like that are happening at the same time amongst these bigger shifts.
Yeah, I don't think we want to make sure that, we're not saying that all of this vote and all of that vote go the same way, right?
Sure.
You can subdivide. I mean, the beauty of statistics is you can subdivide as much as you want, down to individual people almost, even with just using mathematics and polling and all sorts of other different, especially with the internet, all sorts of other different demographics now.
Yeah.
But it is interesting, I think, that now it seems, this is maybe just coming from where I grew up. I grew up in the middle of the country in a very white, small town, and it seemed like the wider your view is, it does seem the more liberal you are, though that doesn't necessarily play out in the demographics, because it may depend on your religion, it may depend on what school you went to, what your education is, and not even just college, but what you decided to major in can change how you view the world around you, obviously.
Yeah.
So, there's also, I think, interesting when it comes to age. I have, as many of you know, a science background. So I was just doing an episode for our science show about how voters look at faces and will make judgments right away. And there was a study done just recently, and in I think the Journal of Cogent Psychology, which sounds like a great name. It sounds really good. But they said basically, given just 100 milliseconds, people can determine all sorts of different things. And older voters tend to pick attractive faces more often than they do other. And younger voters tend to not pick attractive faces more often, which I just thought was a really cool anecdote.
That shocks me, because it seems like, those sorts of tests, the implicit bias tests and things like that, like back when I was in academia, we'd have those for race studies and the police and everything. And normally that's in the academic sphere, but now we have a generation of people who are growing up with apps like Tinder, where they are forcing themselves to make those judgments every couple of seconds, sometimes for me, hours a day. And you would think that would eventually...
no one swiping back. Just hours and hours he just
the
goes.
app is broken because there's no
must
matches.
I heard it's broken, so don't worry about it, Sean.
Gotta be what it is.
Totally just...
You'd think that maybe that would have an effect, but there's still, even with a culture that we're continually told is shallow and materialistic and entitled, they apparently look more than skin deep at higher rates than older people, and that's surprising.
Yeah, I thought so too.
I mean, I think for all of us, it was very surprising, and I even said to you, I was like, what?
Yeah,
That's an amazing statistic. But maybe we are just more elevated than our parents' generation.
Maybe.
We're just better.
Well, and really fast, also, we certainly have access to more information. I mean, if you were interested in a presidential candidate in the 70s, you could find information if you wanted to, but I can find tons of information right now if I want to. I can find out their entire voting record, ideological scores from their time in government, statements they've made, interviews. I can find all of that. I don't have to rely on just the facial symmetry that they might or might not have.
Well, that brings up the Kennedy-Nixon debates, of course, right? I mean, that was the turning point for they say the entire election was everyone looked at Kennedy, they looked at Nixon, they were like, I'll take the attractive young guy over the guy who's had 5 o'clock shadow and was angry and gruff. But, as they did the polls and they said for those who listened in, those who were listening actually felt that Nixon won. But those who were watching. And now all of those people are older and in essence sort of got trained, have our media trained
Yeah.
to look at how people look on television and make certain,
That's
arguments for or against. There you go. President
you never
2020,
know.
right
yeah,
here.
exactly. You never know. Like, and that's, I think, interesting too, because I imagine every step of the way, the media has affected the demographic breakdown in their voting choices as much as the reverse, right? So, like, I've looked up Teddy Roosevelt's voice on recording, and he had a very high nasally voice. But when you see this, dude with a cool mustache standing like in the American frontier, you think like, that guy sounds
my
like
guy.
a radio drama, like, hello, I'm Teddy Roosevelt. But he really sounded actually even a higher voice than I have. So, I mean, it's
Shocking.
I know, right?
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
no.
But I think that's very interesting, and I'm sure that having to hear that or see that and now we can get all of this background information, it's slowly kind of changing how we look at our presidential candidates.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, I do want to talk about how millennials don't tend to turn out to vote that much. So even when we do break them down by race and topics and things that people are interested in 2012, we had one of the lower voter turnout rates. The lowest was for millennials. It was very low.
Yeah, look, I hope that even if Bernie's not going to get the nomination now, but obviously he was extremely popular amongst young voters. We know that Hillary Clinton more popular amongst young voters than Donald Trump. Even Johnson is close to Trump in the youth vote share. And by youth, I mean below 45. Like, we're not talking about like 18 and 19.
Right, yep.
I'm hoping that being drawn into the primaries in a bigger way, a more visual way, a more visible way, I should say, hopefully that translates to higher participation come November. Look, I would hope personally, one of the things I want out of whoever becomes the next president is National Voting Day, because younger people everybody has a lot of constraints on getting out to vote, but for young people who are in school or working jobs, they don't necessarily have that freedom. Yeah. And I want their voices to be heard, and their voices aren't going to be heard unless they can actually get out there and vote.
Yeah. I mean, there's an enormous amount of talk, right? The millennial vote, but just as you pointed out, the millennial vote went down and was actually ultimately not really the reason Obama won.
Right.
So everyone's sort of hinging everyone's hopes on what are the millennials going to do, and will they come out for Hillary Clinton? I certainly hope they do, because I want people participating in the process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do I think that it's necessarily going to be the reason someone does or doesn't win? I don't know that, because in 2012, all of the data, at the very least, says that wasn't necessarily the reason he won, because they didn't in 2008 they came out at much bigger numbers, but in 2012 it fell.
Yeah, I don't remember what the numbers are, but it was something like they didn't drop by as much as it would seem. It wasn't like half, it was like 7 or 8%, but it's a decrease. And as we've just discussed earlier, 7 or 8% can make or break an entire election. It changes at local levels, can change all sorts of different things, even just a few people.
Yeah.
Which comes, I think, to a different point, and that is that a lot of young people, especially those who are media savvy, are looking at their state and saying, well, I'm not in a swing state. Mm-hmm. So why do I have to vote? My vote doesn't matter. I'm not in a swing state.
Yeah.
Which I think is also part of that deal. It's almost information.
I mean, you never know, because swing states, like, we have ones that we think of as traditionally being swing states, but it does change from election to election, and for the reasons that we've been talking about, demographic trends and things like that. But look, your vote represents more than just the choice. I mean, the popular vote does matter. If not electorally, then it can make you feel better about what happened in 2000. The fact that Al Gore did win the popular vote. But then also, like, you should be going out to vote for the state level races as well. It's not just for the presidency.
Yeah.
And simply having your group be represented, whether it determines who wins the presidency or not, that makes politicians in the future more likely to listen to the concerns of your group. And so there's a ton of good reasons to go out to vote, even if it's not going to be the decisive factor.
Yeah, I think it's get engaged, right? Mm-hmm. Get excited, get into it. And again, if you're not super thrilled with, the person at the top of the ballot, vote all the way down. The idea of abstaining from a vote when that is something that is so integral to our country and our democracy, it breaks my heart, right? I mean, that is something that we take so much for granted, or many people do. And that's what makes this country so special.
Yeah.
Dare I say, that's what makes this country great.
Yeah.
Again.
Maybe continuing.
Continuing.
Michelle Obama says still.
Yeah,
Still,
continuing
that's
to be great.
If for nothing else, your polling place is almost certainly going to be a Pokestop on election day.
Also
And
that.
it's probably going to be lured all day long. And so
Oh,
hang
that's
out.
great,
You can
yeah.
probably meet some people. You can get some Pokemon. It'll be great.
You just copied Hillary Clinton's joke. Sorry. You did.
Damn it.
She
Kiss,
gave a
kiss.
whole speech where she said, what was it? It was Pokemon Go Vote or Go Vote
Yeah,
at your
yeah.
polling place. So I don't know what to tell you,
I
man.
wonder if she knows what Pokemon are.
I
Her
think
staff does.
her staff was informed.
There you go.
Her,
At the very least.
her staff know what's up with the
savvy.
dank memes.
Yes.
I'm pretty sure.
They are big on the memes.
That's like
So-
a phrase, I think. I think that's a phrase. I do want to kind of get into one of my favorite topics to talk about, Brexit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because that also, the voter demographics really spoke a lot of volumes there. So it's almost like being drawn as a parallel to our own experience coming in November, right? I did some averages based on the numbers. They broke it down 18 to 24, 25 to 34, and so on and so forth. But if you break it down, the average less than 34 was 32.5% voted leave, and the rest, 67.5%, voted to remain. But over 45, it was almost the swap. 58% voted leave, and 42% voted remain.
Yeah.
So there does seem to be a demographic breakdown there as well.
Yeah.
Older voters.
Yeah, and look, I mean, basically every policy, you can make the argument that aside from something like Social Security in the short term, is going to affect younger people more because they will live under that system for longer. And especially Brexit, where it at the earliest, it's not even going to happen for 2 or 3 years. Many of the people who voted to leave won't even be alive to see the leave happen.
True.
And so that's what makes it
But
so
they
sad
got
to see.
their word in.
Their
They
last
got it
stand,
in.
right.
They did.
The last stand.
And that's why it's disappointing to see younger people not more engaged in something that is going to affect them for literally decades.
Yeah.
And it's easy for the older people to say, well, of course we should have more influence. We know more. We have the wisdom. But as
Right.
you were talking about, there's every reason to believe that older people can vote for as shallow reasons as anyone else.
Exactly. I think that's a good way to put it too.
Yeah.
If I were to guess, because I don't know if we have the data, but if I were to guess, a lot of the young people are in the urban areas.
Probably.
I would venture. So if we're using that as the baseline, London, for instance,
Yeah.
heavy Remain.
Yes.
Yeah.
People didn't go out to vote as much because in the bubble of London,
Everybody
everyone
was
was voting to
voting. Yeah.
remain.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so I think it also speaks to the idea of, getting out of your own echo chamber because the world
Yes.
is going on around you and it might not agree with exactly what you're thinking.
Yeah.
So, for at least, we're saying for the Democrats, they can't take anything for granted because if you just listen to your own media and your own, Facebook feed
Yeah.
and you don't look beyond that, then you're playing a dangerous game, and that came to bear in England.
Yeah, in that Brexit vote, for sure. And if you look at the maps, it definitely was like urban areas tend to vote some ways. And I think that actually speaks to your point. It was something that I was thinking of when you were talking about how when you leave your small town and you're encountering people of different backgrounds and different, whatever, any kind of demographic you want to point to, you're going to encounter somebody.
Yeah.
That often happens in urban areas as well, which,
Yeah.
may be one of those reasons that people in urban areas tend to vote more toward progressive policy because they're more encountering of those people of different backgrounds.
Yeah.
I read once, don't quote me on it, I think it was in the Hillbilly book.
We're
but
saying,
no
no quotes
everything's in
here.
that book.
No quotes.
But
This
then
is a
it
Very
was,
good book, you guys. It was a fantastic interview.
one of the strongest correlations for being a registered Democrat was possessing a current passport.
Yeah.
And so that might go to the same.
Yeah, for
That
sure.
was on page 232, by the
Yeah,
way.
there you go. Wow, you know a lot about the book other than its
Just
title.
the title.
You just have
the
all that
title
other
escapes me.
information.
I do.
Yeah.
I do. Very, very particular. I just don't like titles, apparently.
That's fine. I feel like as long as the content's there,
Yeah.
content is king.
I mean, I'm very tempted to check my phone so I can pull this up and be like, haha, I was right.
Yeah. I think one last thing is today they came out, not today, maybe this week, they came out with a study breaking down kind of Bernie delegates and voters and things. And they said that 90% of people who were voting Bernie or were interested in voting Bernie are now voting Hillary, which I think also speaks to getting out of your bubble because the more you dig into that number, that only 1% are really contested, the more you realize that they only asked them about 2 candidates in those questions.
Yeah.
The Pew number says 90%, 44% changed their preference from Bernie to Hillary. However, questions prior to this in polls, they'd only asked them or they were asking them about all these candidates, and now they only ask them, do you want Trump or do you want Clinton? And that's it.
Right.
Yeah.
So of course it's going to change your numbers. So I mean, there are little biases individually, but also on a mass level.
Yeah, and that's one way that you can get the result you want in a poll, by not representing all of the options. And we know currently it looks like Johnson's getting somewhere between like 9 and 11%. Jill Stein's getting like 3%. That's a significant percentage together. That almost, if you can combine the two, you can almost get on the debate stage with that. And we also know that against all odds, Johnson is actually drawing more support from Hillary Clinton supporters when you cull it down to 2 candidates from 4 than from Trump. And she beats Stein amongst registered Democrats and liberals. Now, those third-party polling numbers tend to be higher at this point in a general election than later on, or especially on Election Day.
Yeah.
But there's certainly reason to believe that this election won't be like that there's more reason in terms of who's nominated both for the Republicans and the Democrats, that people might want to continue to support third-party candidates. I personally believe whatever the percent is of Bernie supporters who say that they're going to vote for Trump, I'd like to say that you're crazy as a Bernie Sanders supporter. There is no justifiable explanation or argument for why you would do that. If you want to sit at home, fine. I'm sure there's a lot on Netflix. But voting for Trump is absolutely insane on the issues.
Sean King actually came out, I believe it was today, and he's the Daily News reporter and who has an enormous following, was a very, very passionate Bernie supporter. And he came out and he said, I am absolutely voting for Hillary Clinton. To not do that would be, A, to go against what Bernie Sanders has requested and what he's pretty vehemently now said, but B, it really goes against every single issue that Bernie has highlighted.
Right. Yeah.
And he said, basically the idea is we can work with Hillary. There's probably no shot. And he pointed to specific groups. He pointed to immigrants. He pointed to Black Lives Matter. And he pointed to, oh my goodness, I think it was the Muslims as well. And he said, look, I have friends in all 3 of these areas, and I have to do what I can to make sure that I am not doing something to harm them.
Right.
And I think that's, the combination is really powerful. I think we're going to continue to hear that, not just through the convention, but for the next several months until the election.
Yeah.
And so when people get in the voting booth, they may end up saying, look, everyone's been saying it. It's probably true. It's really a question of one or the other.
Right.
Yeah, since we're focusing on numbers, I mean, we talked at the very beginning about how Hispanic voters, Asian voters tend to be focused in certain states. There will be 4 candidates in the race, or more technically, but 4 candidates. But some of them won't even be on the ballot in certain states. And so regardless of what the polls say, when you get to the actual polling place on that day, you may not be able to vote for Jill Stein or Johnson either.
Yeah, and that's a great point, is that, we are a collection of states that are voting for a leader of a federal overseeing government, right? We are not necessarily set up as a one group.
Right.
Yeah.
And even then, to kind of bring it back to all politics being local, you really are only voting against the people in your area.
Yeah.
You're not voting against people in another state, in another city. You're only voting in your electoral region.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's the key. And only a few states does that specific region compete against the others, but most states it's winner take all. But still, it's important to get out and vote, because you only have so many neighbors and they're all voting too.
That's true.
Yes, hopefully in a positive and forward-moving direction. And I think sounds like we all are maybe coming from the same perspective. But if nothing else, it is fascinating. And I do want to reiterate, despite the lack of recognition of the name, the title of the book, which again, I could pull out right now if you want me to do a search, because I can find that.
Why don't you tweet about it after?
I'm definitely going
stream.
to.
Yeah.
But I think we really have to recognize that people are really hurting, and a lot of people, we can sit back and we can laugh and say, who are these folks supporting Donald Trump? But they're Americans, and they have concerns and fears, and they haven't been addressed, and they need to be addressed, and that matters, and that shouldn't be shot down, and it should be respected.
Yeah, like I said, he's talking to them on a language they understand, in a place where they live, and these are concerns that they really have, and they're valid concerns in the same way as any other voter demographics concerns are valid. It's not to be marginalized because they are of some background in the same way as any other person is from a different background.
Yeah.
Totally.
I think that's probably a good way to wrap it up. I know we're doing other live streams throughout the week, so make sure you guys subscribe. The Young Turks, you guys are live streaming every day?
Yeah, from 6 p.m. till like 11:30 or 12 Eastern at youtube.com/The Young Turks.
Right. And are you doing anything else during this convention?
I am. I'm also live streaming. What? No one does that. If you go to Newsy News on Facebook, the easiest way to actually also get there is go to newsynews.tv. It's NEWSY, That redirects you to the Facebook page, and then you can follow along there. And then I'll be posting videos on YouTube as well.
Awesome. And you can, of course, find us all on Twitter and other social media.
Yeah.
You're going to probably want to do that if you want the headline of that book.
Yes, which I absolutely
definitely
want for you. And now I'm just going to sit here and look it up because I can't stress enough. It was a really meaningful article.
Now I have something to read. For
there
sure.
You go.
For the flight home.
Yeah. Thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe here on YouTube for more Seeker Daily. You can also find us over on Twitter, Instagram, and we're doing Snapchat as well throughout the convention. So thanks for tuning in. See you next time.